Welcome to another episode of Chax Chat. Join Chad Chelius and me, Dax Castro, where each week we wax poetic about document accessibility topics, tips, and the struggle of remediation and compliance. So sit back, grab your favorite mug of whatever, and let's get started.
Welcome, everyone, to the Chax Chat podcast. We're really glad you all tuned in today, and we've got a lot of great stuff to share with you. I wanted to make everybody available that Dax and I are hitting the road in the upcoming months. On March 9th to 13th, we are going to be at the CSUN Assistive Technology Conference in Anaheim, California. So if you're in the Anaheim area or you're going to the CSUN conference, please look us up when you're there. We'd love to catch up with you and talk with you and learn more about you. And then on April 19th to 22nd, we are going to be at the Adobe Summit in Las Vegas, Nevada. And again, if you're going to be in the Las Vegas area or you're heading to the Adobe Summit, look us up. We'd love to talk with you further and learn more about you. So my name is Chad Chelius. I'm an Adobe certified instructor and one of the accessibility wizards here at Chax Training and Consulting.
And my name is Dax Castro. I am one of the other wizards at Chax Training and Consulting, and Chad and I both are certified as accessible document specialists by the International Association of Accessibility Professionals. And if you'd like your certification too, head on over to accessibilityassociation.org/certifications and get more information about it. Chad, you mentioned we're going to be at CSUN, which is really the doers conference. If you are ever at you want to go to a conference where you can interact with people with disabilities, CSUN is the best place to go. It really allows you to see the clientele that are actually benefiting from the things that you're doing. And then Adobe Summit is really for the executive level. So if you've got a boss that isn't really bought into the idea that accessibility is a thing they need to be doing, come find us or have them find us or reach out to us and we'll go find them at CSUN and have a conversation. I'm teaching a session on how to eat the accessibility elephant in the room, basically how to start accessibility at the organizational level. And it's going to be a great session. And then finally, the website, Chad, we don't want to leave people out, let people know that we started the new year with a new website, which is super exciting, right?
It really is. It really is. You know, our old website, Dax, you did a great job, but it was also done in the middle of the night. You know what I mean?
It was shoestring and a WordPress build and just get it up and get it going. So it's served its purpose.
It really did. It really did. And I think it was really successful, to be honest. But I really want to thank our team member, Amber Weeks, for all the work she did on that website. I think it turned out great and I'm excited. Every time I go on there, I'm like, wow, this is really looking good. So very exciting.
Yeah. So head on over to chaxtc.com. A lot easier to type than accessibilityunraveled.com, which still works. Chax Training and Consulting. So chaxtc.com.
Yep.
So today we have a great guest, Walt Zielinski, who is a web developer. And we are going to be talking today about forms and the idea of the work and process that goes into choosing the right form, the right platform, and all of that. And Walt, we have you on really because you have the great insight of being on the web side of things. So thank you so much for being here today.
I'm so happy to be here.
Awesome. Well, I want to start off by starting at the beginning, right? And I'd love for you to maybe give us some insight about whether or not a PDF or a web form is the right direction. And I'll give you a little bit of setup here. There's a large school of thought that people say PDF should die. Nothing should ever be a PDF, that everything should always be the web. And I wonder if there's a balance there. And I'd love to get your opinion on what makes the choice, the decision to go to a web form versus a PDF or vice versa.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's a few things you might consider. One being, what are you doing with the form? What's happening with the data in that form? Are you trying to save it? Are you trying to do some marketing with that information? Are you trying to, display some kind of calculation based on some numbers? I think those types of things where you're either storing that data or manipulating the data to do something more interesting with it, that's a cue or clue that you're probably going to want to do something on the web, because I think that's where those interactive experiences actually shine and are well supported, right? And you're going to be able to do things like in the accessibility tree, announce these changes of context changes in the page to the user very, I don't know if I should say easily, but you can absolutely do them with ARIA and with these tools that are available. Whereas, if it's a form that you're intending to just email something to someone else, like it's just form fields that are not actually, getting stored somewhere. You're not trying to manipulate the data. You just need to get it from one place to another. That might be a clue that maybe a PDF is okay in those scenarios. Like the less interactive, I feel like the more a PDF can actually support that well and make it usable for someone with disabilities.
Awesome. Chad, from a PDF standpoint, what are some things that would make you want to go to a PDF versus a web form, and maybe even deciding what source file you're going to start with? Because I know that's an important decision in the birth of a form from source file to PDF.
Right. Yeah, that's a really good point, Dax. I'm going to address the latter question first. Regarding like what method you should use to generate that form. You can, in theory, you could start with any program you wish, right? It could be Word, it could be PowerPoint, it could be Excel, they all allow you to make a PDF, and then from there you can add form fields to it and, build it from there. The source file does, however, indicate your level of effort in the process, right? So, unfortunately, although Word allows me to create form fields in Word, those form fields do not carry over when exporting to the PDF format. So, regardless of how much work you did in there, you added form fields, you did whatever, they're not going to carry over to the PDF file. So
aren't those Visual Basic form interactive forms? I think that's the code level.
You're testing my knowledge on that one.
Okay.
I know in Word you're able to go in there and add form fields, and then they will function within Word themselves.
Right.
However, but you're kind of locked into Word at that point, right? And that's
right.
kind of a limitation because not everybody has Word, right? We want to say that it's ambiguous, but it's not really,
Well, I think we should stop there for a second and talk about that as a workflow. So one of the drawbacks one of the benefits of doing a form completely in Word is that it's completely in Word and you have editable control. However, if I give that form in Word to someone else, I can't lock down the content inside that form and still have it be accessible. So titles and descriptions and things like that can easily get manipulated or overwritten. And a lot of times that's a drawback for people because they want to know, hey, only the form field is the thing I want you to touch, right?
Absolutely. I mean, people have even made the argument to me like, hey, why should I go to the PDF format at all? Why don't I just keep it in Word, make the Word document accessible, and then I just give it to whoever I want to?
Right.
The danger there is that they can manipulate that information, right? And they can make it say whatever they want to, right? If people know enough. So I totally agree with that statement. So regarding a source file, I would say that gives me the biggest bang for the buck. Everybody on this podcast has heard me say it, and I think you say it before. Adobe InDesign is probably like the most robust tool that we can use to create PDF forms. It allows me to create all different types of form fields. The form fields are tagged when I make the PDF. And if I anchor the form fields, they're in the right position, right? So It's just kind of like win, 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 right? All the way around.
because we know people make changes to these forms all the time, right? And when you do it in Word, you create all your base content in Word, export to PDF, add your form fields on top of PDF. But if somebody goes back and changes the form, the underlying structure, the Word doc, you're kind of screwed. But with InDesign, it's so fluid that you can just generate a new PDF, right?
Well, and I'll take that to one more level. I literally had a consult with a client today, Dax, who she was complaining because some of her form fields were date fields. And she wanted them to behave as date fields. And then she had a zip code field, a couple of other fields. And she was frustrated because every time she made the new PDF, she had to manually go into those form fields and modify the properties so they behaved as a date field or a zip code or, it was extra work. Right. And so I showed her leveraging made to tag to automatically format those fields for her automatically when exporting out of InDesign. So huge time saver. And that's another topic for a different discussion, right? But just a way of like, again, it is a limitation, but there's ways around those limitations as well. Yeah.
Well, going back to, so I think what I'm hearing you say is that from an interactive, from a workflow standpoint, Word is possible, PowerPoint's possible, Excel is possible, but the amount of work that you have to do in the PDF stage after you're done exponentially goes up depending upon which choice you choose. Excel is garbage for exporting a form in any kind of table way. PowerPoint is slightly better, and Word of them all is probably the best of what it can do. But the one that trumps them all is InDesign and being able to export from InDesign. Great. So Wally, from an interactive standpoint, what are some of the limitations of a web form where you would go, hey, maybe a web form is not the right choice here because you want to do this?
I mean, I guess it's a weird question because it's almost inverse where, like, I would say the web stuff, the limitations are not necessarily in what you can do. You can do almost anything these days with JavaScript, HTML, CSS. You can really get a lot done. However, where I'm thinking you might, the difference is in maintainability, right? And who's actually maintaining this? What's the cost of maintaining that? Those are the questions I would pose is like, do you have a developer who's going to be able to like keep up with this and make bug fixes and add features and all these things, and it's going to live on some server somewhere? Do you have all that stuff sorted out? Like maybe you already have a website and maybe you have a way of, some developers on your team who are able to, add this kind of functionality. But if you're used to being the person, building your documents, you're the documents person, you may not have those resources available to you. So I think the limitation is more in like, do you have the capabilities and the skill sets to actually get that on the web? Because there is lots of like, I don't know, these like site builder tools that are out there, but
formidable. Yeah. In fact, all the Chax, the original Chax forms were all built using formidable forms because it was a WordPress plugin. I didn't have to know anything, and it has conditional logic that I can just say this field plus this field or calculate this, or if they choose that, then give them these other forms. So it's really powerful, but it's a very unitask thing. And when we pass the website on to a new developer, now I don't have control over any of that. A developer has to make those forms.
Yeah. So it depends, I think, on how long it needs to live for. Like what is this purpose is it serving? Is it going to be long lasting? And is it going to be in do you want it to be in a position where it can, be editable more easily by just saying, I'm going to re-upload a new PDF and now my form is updated, as opposed to, I need to go tag this person, or I need to go into WordPress and mess with all these fields. And maybe I don't go into WordPress that often, and now I have to relearn all this stuff. There's like, it's just different tiers, I feel like, of like ability levels that you need to think about when you're making that consideration.
Wouldn't you say, Walt, that it really just comes down to appropriate planning? Right? Like don't just dive in and just make a form, right? Like think about the use case for that form. Think about like how it's intended to be used. Think about how people are going to be interacting with this and approach it the right way, right? Rather than just kind of like diving in and, trying to get this done, because I've said that before. Dax and I ran into a lot of people who are like, everything should be HTML. PDFs should die, right? And I'm like, well, that's great, and in a perfect world, I love that theory. But how many of you are able to go onto your corporate intranet or your public internet and create HTML content? And then they're like, oh, like, yeah, right. Like, only certain people are able to do that, And so that I think is one slight limitation in deciding which way to go, is that, are you capable of creating the HTML form, or do you have the right person who can build that form for
and
you?
are you willing to bear the burden of the cost of that, right? It's a lot more expensive, even in the long term or even the short term, to like build something in, if maybe you're doing it from scratch, you have like React or one of these like single page app, libraries at your disposal. Maybe you can like do something fully custom, and that's like a whole other thing. But even if you are using like a WordPress plugin or something like that, it still takes more time, I think, to like put those pieces together, and that just is more, it's more money. So
it's development time, right? I mean, now we're developing. Now we're getting into some deep and heavy stuff, that needs to be executed.
Yeah.
Well, and now who's going to maintain that? Who's going to bug fix,
of course,
and go through all that? So, Walt, would you give us some examples of maybe some platforms? You talked about kind of these plug and play plugins for websites, but I know a lot of people use web forms, right? There are third-party platforms that specialize in just being a form, right? Google, what is it? Google Forms. I'm not familiar enough with all these, but can you give us some examples of some of the better ones that are web kind of plug and play forms?
Yeah, you're putting me on the spot a little bit, but I will.
That's okay.
I will do a little bit of Googling in the background. I think the one I wanted to mention for sure is Typeform. I think it's not perfect in the accessibility sense, but it is keyboard operable by default, which is one of the things I really like about it. Like when you set up a Typeform, you're usually shown one or two fields at a time. Like it doesn't show you a ton of things all at once. It gives you a nice progress tracker, but then you can also, especially when it's like a multi-select or a radio kind of, input, you can it'll show you like, this is option A, B, C, D, and you can just hit that letter on your keyboard and it'll select it, move you to the next question. So Typeform is the one that came to mind first as like, if I were to go and make a form right now, it probably would be that. But I think it really does depend on, your use case and what you're trying to do with the data. Maybe if it's something for your mailing list, something like an Airtable or like one of those like MailChimp or something, like sign up forms or whatever, you can create those things in those platforms also. And then you get like sort of a back end view that's got like all the tables and all the different information that people submit. Obviously Typeform is going to have that stuff too. I'm just kind of saying like, it depends on where you want it and why you want it and kind of what integrations are important to you. I would ask those kind of questions. But yeah. And then for WordPress, there's so many. If you just Google WordPress form plugins, there's, Gravity Forms and Formidable and all these things that there's a million of them out there. So a lot of times, whatever theme you chose when you got WordPress will sort of dictate. Sometimes the themes come with a certain subset of plugins, or they support a specific plugin over one or the other. And so that might limit your options. But the world of WordPress is very, very wide. So you can really find a lot of options that way.
Maybe let's pivot for a second and talk about some of the accessibility considerations when you're building a form. And so I'll start with you, Wally, and then we'll move over to Chad. So from a web perspective and a print perspective, there's going to be some overlap. But what are some of the things, the gotchas that typically people are missing, or things that they should be considering when they're building a web form?
So with web in particular, there's a lot because you have
maybe just the high level stuff, right?
Sorry. So you have color contrast. You have to make sure that, the fields are visible, especially with focus. When you're moving from, tabbing from one field to another, you need to know which field is currently active. Errors need to be identified and they need to be programmatically associated with the particular field. So it's not enough to just say at the end of the submit field, it just says like, oh, there was a problem with your submission, please check all required fields. Like, that's not really enough. You kind of have to say,
I hate that.
The first name field is invalid, or, the
Right.
email you put is wrong. Give me more than just like a vague statement.
Well, you bring up a really good point, Walt, and I don't want to interrupt you, but I know when I've been filling out forms, I'll just get a generic error that says, you missed some information, right? No direction, no guidance, just make sure you filled out all of the fields, right? And then I got to scroll through, and guess what? The one that I did wrong is highlighted in red, right? So speaking to the contrast situation that you're bringing up, right? You know what I mean? Like it's kind of like right away, whenever I see that, I'm like, oh my gosh, you know what I mean? Like, so it's not ideal, because I can only imagine certain people are really going to have a tough time finding that, I mean, maybe they get lucky. It's highlighted in bold. It's bolder than the other form fields, but it even as a sighted person, I sometimes struggle. I'm like, where the heck is it? What are you missing?
It's not enough to just change the color to red. You have to, do something else. Usually we do like an extra border around a field that's got an error, or like sometimes it'll be like a little red notch on the side or something, like just in something other than just color. But on top of that, you should also have like actual text that's like underneath the field or right above it, that with a little exclamation mark or something that says like, hey, this field is wrong. So yeah, I mean, error identification is one of the ones that gets missed the most frequently on the web, I would say.
Well, speaking of the error identification, the order in which you put that error is so important, because there have been so many times where I'm using assistive technology, I'll enter something and the error message is way above wherever my active focus is, or way below where my active focus is. So while it's visual on screen, I would have to press the down arrow 3 or 4 times just to get to that error message, or up 3 or 4 times. And that's a huge problem. In fact, Adobe, I had mentioned that in the Adobe login, that the login error happens like 2 focuses after the actual item. And that's a huge deal.
Yeah. And I mean, there are ways to kind of mitigate that by, using something like ARIA Live, or something like using ARIA Describe By, or something that can help associate dynamically and, in the code, the error with the field. But yeah, I mean, if you're filling it out, it's getting an error, you're hitting the next tab, or really what's happening is you miss a field, or you don't put in the right information. You hit tab, the validation's triggering. So now the validation's there, but your focus is already down somewhere else. So you do need to add something like an ARIA Live, or some other way of making that announcement happen to the user before they continue through the rest of the experience. Because you'll miss it.
Yeah, awesome. Well, Chad, from a PDF standpoint, one of the things that we've been dealing with recently is the WCAG 2.2 requirement for minimum target size. And that is a AA requirement that says that basically you have to have at least 24 CSS pixels around any of your interactive elements. Now, it does qualify. It is for the web as well. This is not specifically to PDF, but it is something that we find a lot in PDFs, because people try to cram bunch of crap into a very small space. And health forms, I can think of ones I've filled out where they're like, check the box for the following things that, and there's 100 of them, and they're literally right on top of each other, right?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's very difficult to fill out, right? When they cram all that in there. Now, that hit area, right? I mean, just as for clarification, I mean, that's really benefiting sighted, low vision users, right?
Right.
Users of AT, they're just navigating from form field to form field, no big deal.
Right.
But for people with sight who are trying to, get to that area, that hit area needs to be of a certain size.
Also motor disability. Like if you're
exactly,
you have tremors or something, those tiny checkboxes are, you're never going to be able to click on it.
And I highly encourage people, if you ever get the opportunity, download the plugin called Funkify.
Yes.
Because it has a mode that mimics
Tremor.
Yeah. What's it called?
Tremor Trevor.
Tremor Trevor. That's right. And it's just great. I mean, I've heard people describe it as like, imagine sitting in the back of a car on a bumpy road trying to hit buttons on your phone, right? Like that's really what it's like. So yeah, I think it's super, super, incredibly important.
So what are some other gotcha things that we find, Chad, in PDF forms that people tend to miss?
Gotcha things in PDF forms. I mean, I think one thing is using the appropriate form field type.
Okay.
Right. So, text fields are pretty black and white, right? If you wanted to fill in information, use a text field. But difference between checkboxes and radio buttons, right? That's a huge one, right? So, radio buttons are what we call mutually exclusive, and they only give the user the opportunity to choose one of the array of options, right? So, classic example is true, false, right? Should always be a radio button, right? It's either true or it's false. But it can also be used where you say, what is your age? What is your age range? Right. So it's, that you've seen it 18 to 25, 26 to 35, right? We all hate getting into that next category, right?
Get it? Yeah, exactly. Like 45 to 50. And then I'm like, the next
really?
one, I'm always like, okay, 55. I'm still in this category.
I know.
Shit. Next year, I'm going to be in a whole nother category. Getting old sucks. But yeah, so you bring up a good point. So the radio button and the checkbox debate. And what we find most of the time is people say, I want my radio buttons to behave like checkboxes. And they want a checkbox to be mutually exclusive where I can only choose one checkbox. And while it's sort of possible inside PDF, it hurts my soul to do it.
It's just the wrong way to do that.
It is. And the reason that I dislike it, cause you're right, you could do it, right? If they really want it. And I've had clients who've been that way. You've had them, right? Where they're like, I need it to be this, but like people who fill out forms have started to recognize, it's a circle. It's going to be mutually exclusive. It's a square. It's going to be multiple choice, right? So, and when you flop them, now you're creating confusion, in my opinion, right? Yeah. Because they're expecting one behavior and getting the other behavior, and it's just very confusing.
That's one of the things where I would argue, if I was auditing that experience, I would argue that it's an accessibility issue because it's messing with someone's understanding of the form at a fundamental level. Like everyone, like we all understand some things, like the red X means close this window. It's the same with these fields. A circular field is a radio button, and it's going to behave a certain way, and it's going to be different from the square checkbox. I can't tell you how many like legal documents I've filled out where they just use text fields for everything, and so it's like I have to manually type the letter X if I want to fill out that form on the circular thing. It's just like everything's a text field for some reason.
Well, listen, part of the benefit of a form, period, is controlling the data. It's controlling the data so people can't put in whatever they want to in a particular field, right? And so, like a great example is like when you want them to choose what state they're from, right? If you let them type in whatever they want, it's going to be really hard to sort on that data because they could misspell their state. Some people might type the abbreviation. Other people will fully type out the name of the state. And so like to control the data, a drop-down list is way more effective because you're controlling the data, right? They could choose the right one, but then you could sort on that data, right? On your end, right? When you're managing that information. So that, I think that still comes back to using the appropriate form field for the appropriate information. Yeah.
Well, the other part of it too is if you want those checkboxes to be mutually exclusive, you have to add JavaScript. Now you're adding a layer into Acrobat that somebody might not know is actually even in the form.
I will tell you, Dax, just today, I had a client who created multiple checkboxes in InDesign and used the same name for all
Oh.
of the checkboxes,
Oh no.
but the option value was unique.
Uh-huh.
It was behaving like a radio button.
Ah, interesting.
I never tried it. Why would you try that? Why would you ever try that? Right.
Yeah.
But she did that. And I'm like, did you go in and modify that PDF? She's like, no, this is right out of InDesign. I'm like, whoa, I didn't realize that would even work. So
let me say that again, just so I make sure I've got it straight. That if you're in InDesign and you create a series of checkboxes, if you give them all the same checkbox name, the actual name, then when you export to PDF, as long as they have different values, then they could actually be useful.
yeah, they're mutually exclusive. Yeah.
Right. So you check one, it's going to uncheck another one.
Yeah.
The problem would be that you have to include the label into that checkbox. So if it was row, column, or both, let's just say it was a checkbox, you could choose row, column, or both, right? And the value for the checkbox can't be yes, yes, yes. It has to be row, yes, column, yes.
That's a good
both,
point, Dax.
yes.
In her situation, they were all true false.
Ah,
So her export values were yes and no. So in that case, it was working. But you're right. In the scenario you're describing, if you have like multiple choices, I guess you could enter another unique value in the export value to.
I would
Right.
speculate, I don't know for sure, but I would speculate that if you had more than 2 options in this array, that anytime you clicked one checkbox, it would also be clicking the other ones in some way, right? Like it might
because
end
there were
up
only
like,
2. Yeah. So
yeah.
testing it with 3. So testing it with 3 might be the key there, because it might break.
Yeah.
It might work with 2, but with 3, it might break. Good point, Walt. And
I'll have
I
to
think
check
the other part of it too is data sorting, because what are you doing with that data? If it's just a visual print form, great. But you have to export that data or collect all that PDF data and try to make sense of it later. Good luck trying to figure out which variable actually goes with which value. So yeah, not an ideal situation for anything other than I just want this to print out and interact the way I wanted to interact. So
always best to follow the right semantics.
yes.
Getting back to like choosing the right form for the job, I wanted to bring up a situation that I ran into where a client came to me specifically because he did not want a web form.
Okay.
The reason being is that he owned a surveying company.
Mhm.
You know, the survey property, right?
Yep.
A lot of times his workers find themselves in remote areas where they have no access to the internet.
Ah,
So in that situation, you're dead in the water, right? Like, you know, if you're trying to enter values in for properties and things like that, and you're in a remote area, the web is, you know, even if you got a beautifully built form, it's almost useless. So having it as a PDF made it self-contained so that they could operate on their platform, save it, and then they could access it later on.
Yeah, that's a great use case that I didn't even think of, but because I'm never without internet, but
Well, yeah,
there are lots of places that don't have internet or something goes down, like the Verizon outage that happened last week.
yeah,
You know,
yeah.
things like that happen.
Yeah, definitely first world problems.
I was up in the mountains doing some astrophotography. For those of you listening, I've been on this astrophotography kick now for about a little less than a year, and I'm just so enamored by the whole thing. But I'm up in the middle of nowhere at the top of this mountain, and I'm there with some other people. Guy pulls up, unloads his $6,000 telescope on a platform and the whole deal. And then he opens this box and pulls out a satellite panel. And he brings his own satellite internet wherever he goes.
Mm.
And so he is never without internet, which I thought was
that
amazing.
the Starlink?
Yes, he pulled
The
out Starlink.
Yeah.
And he just hooked it up right there. And I was like, what?
That is like uber tempting, I gotta say.
Yeah.
Like, you know, because my wife and I, we have aspirations of traveling like to Yosemite and, you know, all these national parks where probably don't have, you know, access. And the idea of being able to like stick up a satellite and have internet access, that's pretty cool.
Yeah, I will say though, Yosemite does have really good internet access. If you're out there, when
Really?
we did our 50 miler, I think that I mean, we were at the top of Donahue Pass and had internet access, and now maybe in some areas there might not be in some of the valleys, but
Right.
but a good fair amount. They got repeaters out there.
Yeah.
Pretty well. So,
Cool.
Awesome. Well, guys, I hope that for listeners, I hope that this has really been valuable in understanding, maybe navigating the world of forms. And I think what I'll do here is I'll just close with maybe a synopsis that if you're collecting data for further purposes, Walt, would you agree web form is the right direction to go, right?
Yeah, I mean, if you can support it with a good team and what's going to be involved in that, and you're capable of dealing with it, web form is going to be the most accessible and the easiest to work, with the data long term.
Awesome. And then Chad, you would say a PDF form is quick to deploy. You have ultimate control over the entire thing. And when you're just trying to capture the information, InDesign is probably the least amount of work from a source file to PDF creation. Would you agree?
I would. And, I would also just to add to what you're saying, like I always considered PDF forms as like forms for the masses.
Sure.
Because with a PDF form, Adobe Acrobat has a distribute feature.
Right.
That allows you to distribute the form to anybody you tell it to. And when they send it back to you, you can collect it in a common location. And then you could export that data as a spreadsheet.
Yeah.
And it's probably not ideal for like mass amounts of data, but for like smaller projects, it's a really cool, like really effective way of getting that data. So,
awesome.
But I agree with Walt, like on the bigger projects, you need more power, more control. And I think the web is where that's going to be. But for smaller projects, PDF, I think, is still effective.
Awesome. And then I will end with April 2nd, 2026 is our accessible PDF forms class. So if you're looking at getting more training on accessible forms, and some of this has sparked some questions or interest, Chad will likely be teaching that class, PDF accessible forms. So go ahead and go over to chaxtc.com, click on take a class, and then go sign up. And it's a live 3-hour class, and we'd love to have you there. Guys, thank you so much. Walt, thank you for being here today. Chad, thank you for weighing in. I hope that our audience has received some guidance, at least some avenues to travel and think about when it comes to creating accessible forms. And I just appreciate your input. So thank you guys so much.
Absolutely. Thanks everybody for tuning in today. My name's Chad Chelius.
And my name's Dax Castro, where every other week we unravel accessibility for you.
Thanks, guys.